Okay, it's 7:30 Eastern Time. My name is John Bell. I'm the director of the Ballard Institute and Museum of Puppetry at the University of Connecticut, and with my colleague Emily Wicks, our manager of collections and operations, who's backstage making everything happen. We are happy to welcome you to the second Spring Puppet Forum of 2021. Puppet and Spirit, Living Gods, Demonic Snakes, Robotic Buddhas, and Migrant Relics, with puppetry studies scholars Claudia Orenstein, Tim Cusack, Anna Martinez, and Deepsikha Chatterjee. Before we get underway, I want to just let you know that this is a super busy week for us. We just finished a Yukon Gives fundraising event. Thank you everyone who donated. Tomorrow night is going to be our spring puppet slam. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock online, and my colleague Emily will, I'm sure, share information about that. It's also on our Facebook page. It's a Facebook Live event. I think there's 17 or 16 different short shows from all across North America. In fact, please come check that out. And then on Saturday, this Saturday at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, we are hosting for the first time I call it pay-per-view, but we're hosting a performance by Alex and Olmsted of their amazing show, Milo the Magnificent. And I think it's for $10, you can reserve a space for your pod, your family, your affinity group with whom you feel comfortable in terms of public health to see this amazing show. So please come in and see that. Puppet and Spirit is about the diverse relationships that exist between the spiritual world and performing objects, both in traditional forms of puppetry and contemporary artistic expressions. And this forum is co-sponsored, by Yukon Asian American Cultural Center, the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, the Puerto Rican and Latin American Cultural Center, and El Instituto. So maybe we could bring on our panelists, our distinguished group of scholars from all around the place. Claudia and Deepsikha, welcome, and Tim and Anna. So I'm so happy that you're here. Let me introduce you in turn. Claudia is a theater professor at Hunter College and CUNY Graduate Center, and has spent nearly 2 decades writing on contemporary and traditional puppetry in the US and Asia. She co-edited Women and Puppetry, Critical and Historical Investigations, and the Rutledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance, which I got to work on with Claudia. She's worked as a dramaturg on Tom Lee and Nishikawa Koryu V's Shanks Mare, super interesting show. She's a board member of Unimo USA and an associate editor of Asian Theater Journal. And she and Tim Cusack are working on Puppet and Spirit, Ritual, Religion, and Performing Objects. Welcome. Tim, who I just mentioned, is an adjunct lecturer at Hunter College Theater Department, where he teaches basic acting techniques. He was a founding artistic director of the Downtown Indie Company Theater Askew, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was twice nominated for the GLAAD Media Award in the Outstanding Off-Broadway Production category. He was the assistant editor on both the Rutledge Companion to Puppetry Material Performance and Women and Puppetry. His essay analyzing Susan Sontag's celebrity persona through the lens of queer performativity was published in the anthology Susan Sontag and the Camp Aesthetic, Advancing New Perspectives. Next, Anna Martinez is an assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at Texas State University. Her book, Performance in the Zocalo, Constructing History, Race, and identity in Mexico's Central Square from the colonial era to the present, addresses the ways in which the material center of the Mexican capital, the Zocalo, which is an amazing place, manifests and contests its symbolic power through performance practices. Her fields of specialization are theater practices in Mexico, Latinx drama and performance design, and her current research and the work, I think, for Puppet in Spirit focuses on migrancy's material traces and performance. Deepsikha Chatterjee teaches at Hunter College, CUNY graduate, or City University of New York. She has a bachelor's in fashion design from India, an MFA from Florida State University, and is now pursuing her PhD at CUNY Graduate Center. Her costume designs received the Best Costume Design Award at United Solo 2014 and 2017, and her designs have been seen in various New York venues. She's worked at many regional theaters, published about costumes of Indian film and dance, and is presented at USITT, Costume Society of America, and the Rubin Museum of Art. So I somewhat truncated these illustrious biographies, and I welcome you all. I'm teaching a class right now about the history of world history of puppetry, and I'm struck again and again when we're looking at puppetry in Africa and Asia and Europe and the Americas, how much the roots of puppetry are in ritual and religion, and so some forms of spirituality, which is kind of a complicated thing to talk about in the 21st century, as it has been in the 20th century, when we're sort of thinking, I think we think of ourselves, I don't know who the we is, as a sort of secular society. So the idea of puppetry and spirituality is interesting. In my own work, just to blab on a bit, coming from Bread and Puppet Theater, the dramaturgy of a lot of that work is based on traditional, like, Bible stories, but they're not performed in a religious way, but working with Bach cantatas or spiritual music or sacred harp music. So like touching on the spiritual nature of art and performance, but not in a wholehearted way, the way one would do it if one were part of a religion and performing that religion. On the other hand, I think in that theater and the nature of objects and the power of objects has this sort of interesting, considered to have this interesting effect, or the objects have this certain power that I think all puppeteers have a sense of. So ya basta with me. I wanted to introduce first, or ask first of all, Tim and Claudia, or Claudia and Tim, to give us a better sense of what it is you're thinking about in this new book about Puppet in Spirit. And then we thought we would have each of you give a short presentation about what your own perspectives on this are, and then have a conversation among us, and also with those in the audience who might have questions or comments about this fascinating subject. So we're going to turn it over to Claudia, and I'm going to turn off my camera.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here doing this panel, and I should clarify that this is a book project that's underway. It's not coming out yet. It's probably going to be another year and a half or so before we see it, and so this is also an opportunity for us to air some of these ideas and get some feedback and have further discussion. And I wanted to start today by sort of telling you a little bit about how I came to this project. And Tim was going to tell you a little bit more about this sort of shape of the book and how we're working on it. I think, I've in all those things that John was talking about, of things that I've published co-edited volumes. I have one where I did a lot of research on puppetry in India, and especially the Tolpava Kuttu shadow puppet tradition from Kerala, which is done at the Kali temples and performed for the goddess at the temple. It's performed for her, and there's all kinds of rituals around it. And then in the Women and Puppetry book, my article is about a company of puppeteers in Japan and their tradition that goes very, very far back. That's also related to kind of ritual. It's going house to house and blessing homes with their puppets at New Year's. When I had gone to Japan, I was interested, because we were writing the book on women in puppetry, of thinking about women puppeteers, and ended up finding these wonderful women doing a tradition that was originally done by men, but in this ritual form. And I started realizing that I was really compelled by this idea of ritual and puppetry. And in fact, I think I may have been reading something by Jane Marie Law, who uses the term ritual puppetry. And I suddenly had this moment of, wow, thinking like, wow, ritual puppetry, that's a thing. That's a wonderful term. That's the thing I'm interested in when I'm looking at different traditions, that I'm really captivated by this idea. And I wanted to know more about that just for myself. And so I started thinking more about, these traditions that you find all over Asia, that are using puppets to somehow mediate with the spiritual realm, but also about puppets that become empowered in different ways. And as I started thinking about this as a great big ground to cover, I realized, that there's a lot of scholars who are doing interesting work in all these different areas, starting with just Asian puppetry, and my wanting to know more about this. And maybe, I couldn't cover it all, but bringing people together. And then, with Dacia Posner and Alyssa Mello and Larry Switsky, we've been doing these working group sessions at the American Society for Theater Research. And we're always dividing the people who are presenting into different smaller groups. And we've had a couple where there were a lot of papers on ritual, or spirituality and puppetry, or religion and puppetry, or things that were in that nature, but coming from so many different angles. I particularly was taken with the work of Hazel Rickard, who's been writing on the tipping tables and performing objects used in seances, in early seances, and in the 19th century, early 20th century. And then looking into how those also relate to issues about gender and race, and categories from that period, and different conceptualizations, and how they were used by these people who are mediums. And it was coming at it from such a different angle. And I realized there was this really wonderful variety of topics and ideas that people talking about, wanting to talk about this material. And I think, as John was saying too, it's, it is hard in a very secular, predominantly secular, I don't even know if that's really true anymore, but self-described secular society, to talk about these ideas, or ideas, for example, of a puppeteer I met, or a woman I met who's a scholar working with puppeteers in Thailand, who was talking about, something where she had to leave the work early, and somehow she was driving back with her friend, and they were driving on a road that they had been driving on, they'd done, that trip a million times, and couldn't get home. And, her friend said, just stop for a moment and let's go, and we'll do a prayer to the puppets, telling them we'll be back to finish this work. We just needed to leave early, but we will be back. And then, which they did, and then they were able to get home. So these kind of stories and things that have to do with this resonance of power of puppets, that, it's difficult to find the right, especially in academic circles, way of, theorizing and talking about it and describing it. I was also really noticing that there's this really growth, which is, everybody knows of, scholarship in what's called materialism, material culture, and thinking about materiality and how materiality has its own agency, and things like Jane Bennett's book on vibrant matter, which is really interested in the way matter works with human action in these assemblages to create assemblages of agency, but is uniquely, is really wants to strip that from any ideas of any other kinds of, supernatural forces. And so I started thinking about these sort of ritual puppets and thinking, well, maybe there's a greater dimension here worth sort of thinking about and getting people together. How do we talk about it? How do we describe it? And to look at all of these different models. And so Tim, who worked, as we said, on the other two collections of books that I co-edited with different groups of people, John Bell, Dacia Posner on the Routledge Companion, and Alyssa Mello and Carriet Astles on the Women in Puppetry book. I knew that this would be something he'd be interested in. And wanted his collaboration on this. So we started this project, and he can tell you more about like how the shape of the book and how we're dealing with it. But that's those were the ideas that were going through my mind when I thought like, this is a bigger topic than just me. Oh, and just one last thing I want to say is, the other thing is I realized that when I gave some presentations on these topics at like the Puppeteers of America Festival, the Critical Exchange, puppeteers were really excited about this idea and really invested and interested and wanted to hear more about it. So the idea of collecting all these topics together in one place and airing a discussion of this spiritual, kind of ideas and relationships around puppetry, I thought was really important. So Tim, now to you.
Thanks, Claudia. So I'm going to talk about my own personal journey, for lack of a better word, specifically towards this book, actually my presentation, because it's actually relevant to what I'm looking at, which is sort of looking at a piece of pop culture through a specific Buddhist lens. But I do want to mention that having worked on the Routledge Companion, when I was working on that book, one of the essays from that book that has really stayed with me after all these years was an essay that a scholar in New York, Deborah Hilborn, wrote about the use of a crucifix in the Good Friday Catholic rituals. And that spoke to me very directly because I was raised in a very devout Irish Catholic family. And when you're raised Catholic, this idea that objects have spiritual power is not a foreign concept at all. And I remember as a child being profoundly moved during the Good Friday services and profoundly moved watching the crucifix get processed around the church. And for those of you who haven't been raised Catholic, the priest does the Stations of the Cross, and they actually bring the cross to each station. They gradually unveil the cross. And I just remember as a child being so profoundly moved and affected by this gesture, this ritual, this dance, for lack of a better word, that happened every year. And when I read Deborah's essay, it sort of clicked for me what was actually maybe happening in that moment, that there was the power of the puppet and the power of an object to carry spiritual charge. The other thing is I sort of have a history in my life of being the person that somebody comes to when they've got a great idea, but kind of need a little bit of courage to make it happen. And I feel that Claudia, this was an example of that, because Claudia did come to me, but I could sense a certain hesitation or ambiguity or a little anxiety maybe about addressing the topic. And but she did pick me, and I am the person who's like, no, I think this is a great idea. I think this is absolutely what we should do. Who cares what people are going to think? Let's just do it. And then there was a concern expressed, well, maybe there isn't going to be enough interest, or there's not enough people out there in the field who want to write about this. But I encouraged her and encouraged both of us, well, let's just charge ahead. Let's see what happens. Well, what happened was we got so many submissions, so many people wanted to write about it. And we also were a little worried that, well, maybe we're going to end up with too much of one spiritual tradition or too much of another spiritual tradition. You know, one thing I was concerned about was that we would have a lot of spiritual traditions would be represented, and boy, were they ever. And we ended up with people looking at things from a Christian perspective. We have an essay about the use of the Jewish Torah in ritual. We have stuff from Hindu tradition, stuff from Muslim tradition, stuff from Buddhist tradition. So all of the major spiritual traditions are represented here. And there's clearly a lot of interest in this. So what happened was we went from being concerned we weren't going to have enough to fill one volume to having so much of such a wide variety and covering so many different types of things that Claudia came back and said, well, what if we actually asked Routledge if they'd be willing to do two? And it was like, wow, okay, my first project as an editor, we're not just doing one book, now we're doing two, but okay, let's go for it, let's see what happens. And they went for it. They were excited about the idea, they approved the idea. And so where the book has now evolved is that we have one whole collection of scholarship of people looking at, for lack of a better word, traditional forms. And I think that's an important an important idea to interrogate and think about. What do we mean by, what does that mean? But for lack of a better word, the traditional forms. And then we have a second volume that is scholars looking at contemporary artists who are working with themes of spirituality that may or may not be specifically tied to a particular religious or spiritual tradition. And I think that's enough for right now. We can certainly, if people have questions, we're certainly happy to ask questions more about the process of the book later. But I think we want to get now into the actual meat of the content.
Thank you, Tim. That was super interesting. My mind is full of questions and ideas on what is spirituality. So we wanted to now ask our guests to each talk for a little bit about their own particular approaches to this. And we wanted to start with Deepsikha Chatterjee, whose work includes investigating the performative and material qualities of puppets and masks of Ankiya Baona, if I'm mispronouncing that, excuse me, formed from Assam and nearby regions of Eastern India. So thank you, Deepsikha, for being part of this event. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Emily, would you share my images, please? Great, okay. So Ankiya Bhavna is from this Assam region, and it began really in the late 16th century, 17th century, with this polymath character who's called Hunkardev. He's written out as Sankardev in English, but his name is pronounced all S letters in Assam. I should call it Aham, because the S is silent. So Hunkardev traveled to other parts of India where the bhakti movement or the praying to Krishna, Vishnu power was sweeping rest of India. So he brought that Vaishnav tradition into the Aham region. And at that point, it was the Aham kingdom who provided the kind of support to him. I'm going to turn off my camera because I know that my internet has been a little unstable. So Hunkardev, and after that, he had a whole bunch of disciples. Madhav Dev is a foremost disciple. So now that they brought the Vaishnav tradition into this region, They also wrote a lot of the Vaishnav texts that were in use in other parts of India, like the Bhagavad Puran, which is Krishna's life story, but they translated it into the local language, the Ahom language. So all the puppets, and really one could say it is a mask or a puppet in this this form. All the puppets here are based on the Bhagavad Puran. So they all are telling stories either from Ramayana or the Mahabharata, and Krishna Vishnu centric. One point of difference for them, for the Aham tradition, which is called Ekasharan, is slightly different from rest of India, where Radha and Krishna are both prayed together. The conjugal relationship of Radha and Krishna, the female and the male power, it's together. In the Aham tradition, that is not used. So it's singular Krishna. So you don't see the presence of Radha at all. So Emily, we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So given that these are from the Bhagavad Puran, what I noticed when I was doing ethnography there in 2019 was that there was a lot of gods, a lot of demons, and a lot of animals from the Bhagavad Puran tradition and the Vishnu-centric texts that were represented. So I found it fascinating that there were so many demons and demonesses, and their grotesqueness, sort of, representing grotesqueness allowed a kind of exaggeration and expansion onto the body, which was very interesting. So in Ankya Bhavana, so our audience might encounter these terms Ankya Bhavana, or they might encounter the term Satriya dance. And Satriya dance is one of the 8 classical dances of India. So Satriya dance is, I should call it Hatriya, not Satriya, but Hatriya dance is kind of the distilled version of the performance. But I am looking at the masked performance, which is called Mukha Bhavana, where all the characters are masked. And that's where the exciting sort of representational possibilities are come into play. Emily, we can go to the next slide, maybe. Great. So this area, where it is practiced now, is called the island of Majuli. It is the largest riverine island of the world on the Brahmaputra River, which flows from the Himalayas into the Assam region and into Bangladesh, and then drains into the Bay of Bengal. But because it is such a flood-prone area, that there is this huge island that was formed around 6th century CE, but the land is constantly in erosion. However, because it is an island, it has become this sort of receptacle for the Bhavana tradition. So a lot of, so Emily, we can go to the next one and maybe I can elaborate a bit more. Great. So on the island of Majuli, there are temples or temple communities called Hatras. And that this is where the term Hatriya dance comes from. And in the Bhavana tradition, which is the Mukha Bhavana, the masked tradition, and you can see in this gallery, it's all masks, right? The gods, the representation of gods themselves are these puppet masked characters. So here you see Narasimha Dev, who is the combination of a lion and a human form together. And that is the deity in this space. So this is where the audience devotee would come and pray and pay their obeisance to this sort of masked puppet form, right? And the masked puppet form is in attendance in this space constantly in attendance. So we can go to the next one. Great. But depending on which hatra you go to, there are about 28 hatras, but the hatras keep changing because of this erosion issue that happens on this island. For example, there was the Kamalabadi Hatra. So if somebody went to the island in the 60s and 70s, they would have gone to the Kamalabadi Hatra, but then it changed into the Uttar Kamalabadi Hatra because they moved a little bit, they moved north and Uttar is north. So there's constant changes between the Hatras. But what the Hatras do are these sort of devotional communities where they maintain these practices. So in the Samaguri Hatra, which is the Hatra that specializes in the masked dances or the masked puppet dances, there the deity is this Narasimha avatar, which is in the form of the half lion, half human. In the center, we see a very small deity on this pagoda-like structure, step structure, and this is at the Uttar Kamalabadi Hatra. And the performative practices from this region are all based on the manuscripts. So these manuscripts are between 16th and 18th century, and some of them are stored at the Uttar Kamalabadi Hatra Museum. So the Bhagavad Puran that was written was all in this manuscript form. We can go to the next one. Yeah, so this is how the entrance to any of these performance sites are. There are these big portals that sort of inform the audience devotee that you're entering this kind of sacred space. And then there's a lot of agricultural land also associated with these hatras because they're sort of self-contained communities of devotees. So either they're family-based devotees or they're monastic devotees communities. So they have to maintain, they have to sustain these devotee communities. So there's a lot of agriculture and other animal rearing and other kinds of things that also happen in these areas. We can go to the next one. Yeah, and one of the important features of these temple spaces is that once you enter, there's this huge space called the Namghar. And the Namghar is where one would pray. And you can see the devotees sitting over here doing their chants in the morning. But this is also a very large space where the performances would take place, where they would rehearse. And this is also the ritual space where other kinds of ritual activities would happen throughout the year. And the biggest ritual activity in this area is the Ras, which is sort of celebrating Vishnu's or Krishna's life. We can go to the next one. Yeah. And here you can see different performances happening. So on the top left, you see the monastic performers at the Uttar Kamalabadi Hatra. And this was like at 11 o'clock at night, they finished all their chores and then they are performing. But in these monastic communities, very young boys come into the community, like in their elementary school years. And they come from like the local village areas where the parents feel like if their boys get this training, they're sort of getting a better spiritual life. And also increasingly, they're getting a better cultural economic life too, because these performers are performing all over the world nowadays. So they get that training from their childhood. So during the day, they would go to school, and in the evenings, they would be training in the art form. And they live in little, even though these are monastic communities, they live in little bohas, like they're called, they're almost little homes within the hatra. So there might be a good mix of different devotees. There might be an older devotee. There might be two young boys who run errands and do some of the chores. There might be middle-aged devotees who sort of like manage the whole household. So that's how they distribute it. In the center image, we have the Hamaguri Shatra, which is the masked dance tradition. And these are family-based performers. So here you see Khagen Goswami on the side, he's playing the mridanga, the drum, and on the right side in white, and his son is standing right beside. So his son, like from the childhood, like age 3, 4, is sort of inculcating in the performance. But in Hamaguri, not only is the dance important, but along with the dance and music, the making of the costumes and masks is a big factor. And then in the third image, lower right, you see youth community performers in another part of the island, Sonariati. But here, they were like, college-aged girls and boys who have learned music and dance, ritual music and dance from their childhood, but they only come together for specific events to do performances. So this is sort of the makeup of the kind of artist community. We can go to the next one. Yeah. So here you're seeing the gods in attendance. So the Nrsimha avatar is always present in this space, right? And then the human artists are in rehearsal around the avatar. So what happens, because they're Vishnu-centric texts, the Dashavatar, which is the 10 avatars of Vishnu, are central to the storylines. So you see Nrsimha, you see Kurma avatar, you see Varaha avatar. So you see all these gods who came as like different Vishnu avatars, right? And then you will also see other demons who they fought. So you get to see the gods and the demons simultaneously. And in this particular image, they were rehearsing for an event in Banaras. So there was a big fair. I'm forgetting the big fair, but it's every 12 years. I'm going to remember it in a second. And they were going to perform over there. We can go to the next one. Yeah. And as I was saying, there are many forms of the gods and demons. Here you see the Kurma avatar, which is the turtle avatar. On the top, you see a demon, and towards the bottom, you see the 10 hands and the 10 heads of Ravana. So there are different versions of these gods and demons that can be created, but they all have the same iconography. So the iconography is stipulated, right? We know that Ravan has 10 heads, but how the 10 heads are arranged is up to the artists and their creativity. So one thing to sort of, because we're talking about puppets, right? So there are 3 different kinds of masks or puppet masks, one would say, in the Bhavana tradition. There is the full body mask, which we saw in the Nrsimha avatar, which would cover a performer from head to toe. And that is the full body is called the Barmukha. Then there is the half body mask, which would cover the head and maybe till the waist. So the tortoise over here is kind of that half body mask, or even the Ravana over here is a half body mask. And these would be called the Lutukai Mukha. And then there is the mask that is only the face. And those would just be called the Mukh Mukha, which is just the face. What I noticed is that the Bar Mukha, which is the full body, is where we see these sort of expanded. So there's an elephant. There is Aghasura, who is a demon, snake demon. So there's all of these kinds of characters that are represented through puppetry, while and activated by like 3 or 4 performers, while the mask itself is just activated by 1 performer. And we can go to the next slide. I think that's the last one for mine. Yeah. If you notice the center image, this is he's a very famous mask maker, Hemchandra Goswami. And in the previous images, we were in his gallery. So Hemchandra Goswami is a very senior artist, and all the creations they make for masks is always bamboo based. So bamboo in this region is ever present. It's like everywhere you look, it's just bamboo. So they use the local resource to form the framework of the mask. But using the bamboo also allows for it to be very large because it's such a lightweight kind of material that, that they can expand and exaggerate the form. In the center image, he's not making a mask, but he's just making a bamboo sort of sculpture. So within this community, what I noticed is, because they're sort of restricted in terms of doing only Bhagavad Puran based content, they apply their artistic skills in different activities. For example, here on the left, you see concrete statuary. In the center, you see bamboo. And then on the right-hand side, this is Jagannath Mishra. And Jagannath is carving wood. And this is a beautiful wooden portal you see in the backdrop there. So there's different types of material they're applying their skills into. So I think that is my last slide. I know I have a couple of questions, right? Let's see.
There was one question, Deepsikha, about the color blue, which a viewer, Edith McCrae, responded to in an interesting way. So I don't know if...
Yeah, blue is sort of like iconographically stipulated. There is another reference about Krishna drinking poison and getting his body turning into blue. So there is that also. But the blue is usually a given. Like, that the mask makers are going to make something in the blue or dark blue range, but then they have room to improvise. So I'm going to finish there.
Thank you, Deepsikha. That was really interesting and exciting, and made me think about a lot of different things. We want to turn next to Anna Martinez and her presentation from a very different part of the world and very different objects. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, John. So before I go to my slides, I just want to thank all of you for having me here. I'm very excited to be part of this talk and to be part of the upcoming book. And from what Tim mentioned and Claudia, I'm assuming I'm in the volume 2 in the non-traditional forms of puppetry. So what I plan to do for today is that I'm going to show you 3 images. Well, first of all, sorry, going back, the working title of my article or my contribution for the book is titled Relics, Artifacts, and Bones, Activating Migrancy's Traces Through Performance. So what I'm going to do today, right now, is I'm going to show you 3 images that remark on the traces left behind by migrants and refugees in regions near the US-Mexico border. Then I'm going to tell you what am I in general arguing in this piece, in this article, and its connection to the book. As you can imagine, this is a completely different object of study and approach, which I think is one of the things that make this volume so interesting, that there are so many approaches, different parts of the world, different objects, and so on. So if we can go to the first slide, please. Well, actually, yeah, that one. All right, so this is a photograph taken by Susan Harbach Page. Its title is Girls Love Shoes, Brownsville, Texas, 2015. And this is one of the many photos that Susan Harbach Page took and are part of her performative intervention called the US-Mexico Border Project. So the project is from 2007 to 2015, sorry. Page walked the border in southern Texas and documented all the traces left behind by migrants and refugees crossing the Rio Grande. So during her walks, I'm arguing and what happens during her walks, what I call dramaturgical walks, is that she lets herself be affected by the various objects that she finds while examining and reading the ground. So like in this photograph, you see absence through the shoes. The shoes obviously belonged to someone, and immediately as a viewer, we feel connected to those shoes. So other items that she would photograph and that she found along the border, some examples include a comb, a toothbrush, a toy, a pair of shoes, a prayer book, an inner tube, a pair of glasses, a shirt, a bra. So her photographs, like this photograph of the shoes, the girl loves shoes, provide visual references that illuminate our perceptions about the humanitarian crisis in the southern border, where I am currently located. So Paige, this photographer, is also captivated, and this is where the link goes to theater and performance. Paige is also captivated by the objects' fragmented narratives imprinted on them. For example, a comb or a toothbrush found on the ground along the border signals that someone has been detained by Border Patrol agents who classify such items as potential weapons. Another item, for example, a bra, a woman's bra, found in a tree means that a woman has been abused. Self-care items such as lipsticks, eyeshadows, shaving razors hint at stories migrants are trying to fit into the new country. Shoes, pants, shirts, and clothing suggest that migrants have probably crossed the Rio Grande on an inner tube and changed into dry clothes to be taken into safe houses. So her photos, as I just mentioned, make absence present and evoke the act of walking itself, not of just the artist, but of migrants themselves. They connote the wearer's injured body, for example, and debilitating blisters that result from walking long distances and from wearing usually inappropriate footwear. So the connection I make here with what Claudia mentioned with the vital materialists like June Bennett and so on is that shoes, if we just concentrate on the shoes, they behave on migrants' feet, and they can be, the way they behave on their feet, they can be a deciding factor between life and death for border crossers. So the connection to theater, you might be wondering like, okay, and so the connection to theater and to performance is that when I've seen performances about migration or that represent or enact or perform migrant stories, performing objects are central. So if we can go to slide 2, please. All right, so this is performance artist Violeta Luna. So I look into the photographer and then Luna and another case study. So Violeta Luna is a piece called Apuntes sobre la Frontera, Parting Memories. The photo is by Robbie Sweeney. This was taken in San Francisco, 2017. So in this performance, Luna performs a series of scenes about a Central American migrant who leaves her country, travels through Mexico, and arrives in the US to become an undocumented, vulnerable, and marginalized body. So in this photo, what we are looking at is the moment that Luna traverses the space, the stage, presenting these worn out pair of shoes as if they were preserved relics of a saint or a venerated being. And this is something that in Mexico we're very familiar with. It connotes or it evokes preserving relics of saints, or also of, in the so-called secular era, preserving these items as relics of national heroes. So we see her, the performer here, blindfolded by the American flag, and she carries a suitcase on her head. So in here I'm arguing, and I focus on how these shoes, these decaying shoes, become a tangible and devotional relic, and the way she carries them, the way she presents them. They materialize migrants' bodiless presence. So we don't see the migrant, but we see the shoes. So a simple pair of shoes in this performance pushes for associative thinking regarding undocumented migrants and immigration policies. So in Apuntes, in this performance, what I look at is at the objects, but also on how they affect us. And I spent some time talking in the article itself about how that gives us a space to probably be able to mourn, publicly mourn those that the state considers disposable. So Apuntes explores the sensorial qualities of objects and the world around them. It calls for associations that arise from the intensities, these intensities that pass through the shoes, the body, the objects, the space. So it affects us with, probably feelings of anger, anguish, distress, which simultaneously these feelings are productive because it affirms our audience, our political agency. And the next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. And this is a performance by Teatro Línea de Sombra, Mexican theater performance company. The piece is called titled Amarillo, and it's titled after the city in the Texas Panhandle. It's designed by Jesus Hernandez. The photo is by Ricardo Blenda, and it was directed and devised by Jorge A. Vargas. This piece was open, if I remember well, 2011, and it has traveled all over the world. And it continues to be performed, for obvious reasons, because the topic. So in the photo, this is a moment in which we see Raúl Mendoza, the main, the central performer. He plays an everyman migrant who remains missing. So actually, he plays the missing after leaving his home in Mexico. He's wearing cargo pants, this t-shirt, and we see scattered on the stage all these gallons of water that migrants have to carry with them to cross for long distances through the desert. So gallons of water are critical in the telling of migrants and staging of migrant stories. Mendoza carries a gallon of water at the beginning of his trip. At times, we see him desperately drinking from it, as we're seeing here. There are bottles of water, as you can. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see a couple of pairs of, again, shoes, his backpack, where he carries the essentials to cross through dangerous terrains, through the Southwest desert. So in the performance, he actually quotes and shows what he packs in that backpack, which is, a loaf of bread, food, clothing, 3 cans of tuna, a jug of water, and he packs them so to see, to have them as long as they can last. So Amarillo asks us also to adopt a more open-ended perception in which migrants' items, in combination with the other elements on stage, such as sand, they use a lot of sand and water, actively redefine the stage space as one where migrants' bodiless presence is felt. So the objects and the actors here are, of course, central, but it's not the actors activating the objects, but what I argue and what I think happened, at least when I saw these performances, is that the objects themselves stand in for those who are missing. So the next slide, please. And this is, I'm putting them together here just for you to have an idea, visually of a connection, one of the several connections. So just quickly to close this quick my quick presentation is that So what is the connection that I'm making? And, you know, what about spirituality, and what is my contribution to this book? So first of all, performing objects are central, again, in the staging of migrant stories. As Claudia mentioned at the beginning, this term, they acquire vibrancy of their own. They speak to us. And it's not just because are any pair of shoes, but they evoke stains. You know, a stain in a shoe tells us something that probably we cannot name of the wearer. So personal effects, what I'm, you know, what I'm saying in this article is that these personal effects take a similar intense aura in performances about migration as in actually forensic laboratories where migrants and human remains are investigated. So one of the main contributions of this chapter is that it's an interdisciplinary proposal between performative objects and forensic anthropology. Because if forensic anthropologists, which I was able to interview, and I visited a forensic lab here at Texas State where they actually identify human remains and they keep all these personal effects and so on. You know, if these anthropologists read or take a look at these performances, it can illuminate their own affective responses in the lab and their own interpretation of the effects. So as I mentioned, I use a combination of vitalism and affect theory to argue that the items in performance about migration become these vessels for the disappeared if we let ourselves respond to the object's materiality. So it's more for from our audience point of view, right? To take the time to see, to feel, to connect with those personal effects on stage. And what these performances offer us in terms of spirituality is that it's not so much about interpreting or trying to find a meaning of these objects, but connecting with them and probably, hopefully, allow us to identify with migrants' plight and to mourn those who remain missing. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to pass it to John.
Thank you, Anna, for that very different aspect of objects and spirituality. And we now want to turn to Claudia.
Thank you. Wow, I'm also just sitting here absorbing all of this, so much to think about. And it's interesting what you say, Anna, because you know, I'm sort of between different projects right now. And I'm thinking in the I'm embarking on a project next year. I've been very fortunate to get a Fulbright to go to Japan and look into more of the Japanese ritual puppetry that I've already looked into a little bit and see the patterns across Japan of these performative traditions. And there's a strong idea of body substitutes, and Jane Marie Law uses that term within the use of human-shaped objects in Japan in these ritual purposes. So it kind of echoes what you're talking about the substitution of the bodies, or the representation of these bodies through these objects. So it's interesting to see these cross-cultural resonances, and we hope that the book will be helping with some of these too. So as I said, I'm partly looking at Japanese puppetry, but the article that I'm offering to this book is an article that's called "The Matter That Matters," and it starts because I'm interested in this question of, like, well, what makes a puppet seem what makes a puppet good for ritual use? Like, why would a puppet, any particular puppet, become a kind of powerful object? And especially where there are traditions in countries where there are a lot of different kinds of puppets, but maybe some are considered to be used in a certain kind of ritual versus others. And I think there are obviously a lot of different ways of looking at that kind of question. There's certainly history to how things develop. There's just a kind of ritual and religious context. Sometimes, of course, it's just about what materials are available that people build things out of. But I was also interested in if you took the proposal of materialism and you said, well, what if we looked at these traditions and we really just started thinking about the material, and going in that direction, looking at what materials are used and how they're used and what consecrates them or what makes them special, what would we find? And also what, how might there be something different between one kind of puppet that maybe is more powerful than another? And I had the good fortune to do a little bit of investigation in puppetry in Thailand as I was asking these questions. So I've ended up focusing a little bit on that. So maybe you can share my my images. So the Nang Yai puppet tradition, which you're maybe familiar with in Thailand, is maybe go to the next slide. Is these beautiful large scale puppets that are carved out of leather and are used to tell the story of the Thai version of the Ramayana, the Ramakien. And here you see, some of these beautiful images there, danced by puppeteers who hold them with these two rods that you see, and basically dance them either in front of the screen or behind the screen. And actually a lot of it goes on in front of the screen. And you can see here one of an image of Sita being abducted by Ravana. Here's a battle scene on the other one. And these puppets, as you can see, it's not like a jointed single figure, but they're really kind of images in motion. And, it might be kind of curious to talk about this in relationship to spirituality, because in fact, these puppets aren't necessarily known for being part of a ritual performance. These large performances were court performances originally. But there's a long history of doing them as part of ceremonies, especially for funeral ceremonies, not specifically using them, but as part of a kind of widespread entertainment that would go on at funeral ceremonies, and in the especially for the king, and in the recent a few years ago passing of the king at the big ceremonies in Thailand. They had one of these Nang Yai performances. So there's a long history of them, and there seems to be some sense that in earlier times they were used in other kinds of situations. But of course, in a lot of countries in Asia and in Thailand, those demarcations between, what is a secular thing and what is a ritual thing are not always as clear cut as we want to kind of, as those terms of secular religious seem to imply in a more Western tradition. And so there's a lot of overlap. Maybe you could go to the next slide. So here's Hanuman, just showing you a few of these, and the next ones, you can see some of these wonderful images. This is a very different style of the puppet. The thing about these puppets is the tradition, it's originally done at the court palaces, and then when it was kind of discontinued in the court, they went into rural performances. And but today there are really very few places where these are being performed at all. There are three now temples, Buddhist temples, that hold these puppets and actually have some kind of version of performance. And this is one of the temples that has a variety of different ones. You can see a very different style in the puppetry here. And they've collected them really from, smaller companies that were around that were doing it that have kind of died out. One of the reasons I was inspired to look into this tradition, even though it doesn't seem like it's a ritual tradition, is because I had a wonderful master's student, and I could say that a number of the people I think all of the people on the panel today have one way or another come through our wonderful master's program at Hunter College. I had this wonderful student, Patara Danutra, from Thailand, and he wrote a wonderful master's thesis for me about the role of the monks in preserving the Nangyai tradition. And that today all of these puppets are housed in the monasteries, especially these 3 particular monasteries, and that there's a lot of reasons for that that are just practical, that, you know, the monasteries are able to kind of have space for them and preserve them, and they're kind of a center locale in the, you know, in the area, and so they have a kind of, you know, central community kind of function. But also this idea that the monks are the ones who are, because of their ritual practices, are the ones who are powerful enough to contain the spirits in these puppets. So that was very interesting to me as a question, because this is not really known necessarily as a ritual form. So when I went to Thailand, I was asking these questions about, like, well, so, you know, what makes these puppets so powerful? And I wanted to kind of hear about that. Let's see a few more of these pictures as you can go to the next one. Thank you. So this is some museums now where they're, at these different monasteries now, they've kind of started these museums of preserving them and showing off these puppets. The most famous one is the Wat Kanon. This is not Wat Kanon. This is a different temple where they're preserving them. But the one at Wat Kanon has a kind of relationship with UNESCO heritage site, and has built this really lovely museum. And the people who perform it are high schoolers who are from the local area. In the temple we're looking at now, it's also people from the area, and people who are locals, and maybe some people from high schools. And there was also a performance done at the Performing Arts Academy in Bangkok using student performers. You can go on to the next one. And so this is the temple we were looking at, Wat Sawang Arom, and this is one of the local people who is helping to preserve this. And again, I just wanted to show you, you know, you get a little bit of a sense of the performance of these puppets, that some of them are in really bad condition. You know, they were performed for a long time, also with oil lamps originally, and so they've gotten very dark. Just to give a little bit of a sense of that, you can go on. These are just images. You can see these are performances that are being done not by the monks, but by these high school students who are connected with, this is from Wat Kanon. You can move on to the next photo. This is the third temple. This is Wat Bandon. And there again, a young troupe of performers. So, you know, the people who had been older performers they don't really stay around anymore in the villages. And so the monks have to kind of have this relationship with the villagers to kind of get them to do the performance. And one of the reasons Wat Kanon was so important and has become such a central place for this tradition is because one of the older abbots was really basically became an abbot in order to preserve this tradition, was very committed to it. And so there's a kind of personal relationship there too that doesn't necessarily have to do with anything particularly spiritual. But so I started asking, you know, what are the reasons, you know, what is powerful about these puppets? And the answers that I got from a lot of people were that there were 3 reasons, things that make the puppets powerful. One is that they perform the Ramayana stories. And so it's the performance of these stories that is what's really important, and that they're important to teach, even though they are Hindu story, they are important in terms of these Buddhist temples for teaching Buddhist values. This is I want to say rhetoric, this is the kind of discourse about these puppets, is that what's important about them is that they teach Buddhist values, even though they're from Hindu stories in their performances. But there's also a power contained in them in the kind of leather that is cut for them. So there are a lot of discussions about both from people I was interviewing, talking to me about what you know is commonly said, and also I found some lovely archives at Lincoln Center of interviews with puppeteers in the 70s who were at the kind of far end of the tradition at a time when it was really dying out, and they were the ones who had been performing for a long time. What efforts are underway to preserve these traditional puppets and masks? Well, in this particular form, as we said, there's these three monasteries who are preserving them, training young people to perform in them. The hard part is to keep them performing and to keep up performances, or even training other performers after they reach a certain age and decide to, go off and get jobs elsewhere and do other things. A lot of time commitment involved here. And what you see is those old puppets they're preserving in these museum-like environments, but they're trying to teach people to carve new puppets. So the puppets that are being performed with that you see in this image, for example, are all kind of newly carved. So now the things that I'm not completely sure about, these are other questions that I still, want to get answers to, is there the stories about, the kind of leather that you need to do these puppets. And supposedly you're supposed to only use the leather of a cow that has died, sometimes in a unique way, like being hit by lightning, or died maybe a calf that was stillborn, that somehow there's like an unusual way that the animal has died, and maybe that has to do with not being killed or slaughtered, and maybe that's some kind of a Buddhist or karmic issue of not having been slaughtered. And so that there are, ideas about the material itself. And then the third reason for the power of the puppets that I was told is bringing in the power of all the performers who have performed it, all the master performers. There's a kind of power of the performer that gets passed on. And Deborah Wong has a very interesting book called, sorry, let me get you the title of it, the correct title, called Sounding the Center. And her book is about Thai music and the performance troops and traditions within Thai music, and how power is passed on. And there are ceremonies called the Wai Kru, where a special mask is passed over to and put on the head of the disciple from the master. And there's a whole kind of economy of power relationships between master performers and the people who they train. And a lot of that is kind of passed on, she says, through actual objects. So let's go on for a second here, see a few more objects. This is just a picture of the current abbot of Wat Kanon, who's now, in charge of preserving the tradition, and they made a special mask, a special puppet for him, of him. Go on. And this is the current carver, who is not a monk. So they had a picture of a monk who was carving here, but the actual person who we met who was starting to carve these puppets now. So right now, what's interesting, and what I guess is I'm also curious, is about when you ask this question about materiality in relationship to the sort of spiritual questions or power questions, how much as a tradition changes are those things that are necessary to preserve, or do they become less important to preserve? His main goal is to teach people to carve the puppets, because they need to make sure they have more puppets for future performances, and to try and get people who are skilled enough to do this, and to continue to make puppets that they can use in performance, because the current ones, as you see, are being preserved in museums. The older ones are being preserved in museums. You can go on to the next slide. So this is what I wanted to talk about. Even though the main puppets of Nang Yai are not really used in that so-called spiritual way, or one aspect of it, you might say, there is a Wai Kru ceremony, which is in honor of the teacher. I want to use that term. It happens before the performances, and there's also a special one that happens once a year. And there's a Teachers' Day in Thailand, where teachers are honored. So I like to tell that to my students. And these three puppets are of two gods, and the old father is the central one, are honored in this Wai Kru ceremony. And there are a lot of different kinds of records of the Wai Kru ceremony. I wasn't able to attend one, that talk about all the different kinds of offerings that you give, all the different prayers and incantations that you have to do. There obviously, many of them are for having a good, safe show, that the show should be done without any disruption. So there's also this kind of preserving of the show. So this gives another quality to the actual nature of the performance and to these puppets in particular. I'm interested if you show the next image. This one I stole off of the internet, so I'm sorry, because I do have a version of this puppet, but I don't have it in my home here. I brought it back to my office. This is the Old Father, and the Old Father is kind of associated with Bharata, which is the author of the Natya Shastra, this Hindu text about performance. So he has some connection with that, and considered to be the origin of art, or of art aesthetics, or of art performance, and to have this power as the original artist. And within the Waikru ceremonies that Deborah Wong describes for musicians, the mask that they use is the mask also of the Old Father, who is kind of the originator of art and performance, and that there is a kind of traced lineage through this original father and all of the different performers that are being given this kind of power from master to disciple. So there is a version of that in the puppet tradition as well, with this kind of figure, I want to say, the original figure of kind of the power of art, the power of performance. So it's an interesting kind of other way of thinking about what's of spirituality and its connection to art, not just art in the service of some kind of ritual, but art itself being a kind of powerful, a sense of power that is passed on, that virtuosity. And so in those Nang Yai puppets, as the other ones that are done for the performance, so these 3 puppets are never used in performance, they're just for these rituals. The ones that are used in performance have this other aspect to them that get some of the power from all the performers who have used them, who have been part of this lineage. So that's my last slide, and that's kind of what I wanted to offer for today.
Wow, thank you, Claudia. We were in Assam, India, and Texas border, Thailand, and now we're turning to Tim, who has a different world to talk about.
Yeah, we're in Westworld in my chapter. So I'm in the interest of time, I'm gonna try to keep this short, because I personally really want to get to our conversation with everybody. So so the title of my chapter is Crossing the Uncanny Valley, Westworld, Maternal Androids, and the Buddha in the Robot. And just as a preface, Emily, could you just throw up the Uncanny Valley? Yeah, so I'm assuming that a lot of folks in the audience maybe are familiar with this, but in case you aren't, or in case you just wanted a little refresher visual, this is the very famous Uncanny Valley graph that was created in 1970 by the Japanese professor of robotics, Masahiro Mori. And basically, it is an attempt to explain why human beings have a very visceral response to certain types of objects, right? And he created it as an aid to fellow roboticists who were designing robots, right? Because the challenge is, when you're designing a robot, you want a robot that is going to feel, that the human's going to feel that we want to interact with it. But what he discovered was, if it gets too human, there's a certain point at which, in his geographic metaphor, you fall into the uncanny valley. And the nadir of the uncanny valley is the zombie. So the idea of the animated corpse, which is going to fill a normal human with revulsion and disgust. And then eventually you kind of climb back up out of the uncanny valley, and you go through the Bunraku puppet, and then you get back to a healthy living human being, right? So thanks, Emily. So that's the uncanny valley. And the one thing I really want to emphasize about that is that it is a spatio-geographic metaphor. That it's this idea of a place that you go to. So I said earlier that I was going to talk a little bit about my journey to get to this book. And this is actually relevant to Maury, because Maury, I'm basing it on my thoughts on his book, Buddha and the Robot. And one of the big ideas in that book is that as human beings, because our consciousness is so limited, that we can only really see maybe 2 or 3 moves ahead of ourselves. It's not possible for us to see 10, 20, 30 moves ahead of us, right? In whatever actions, whatever karmic stuff is going to happen with our actions. And so really my journey with this book started a few years ago when I was editing a column for the Clyde Fix Report, which was it's a sort of online omnibus publication. And I was editing the TV column that my Hunter colleague Liz Laurie was writing at the time. And as part of one of her columns, she wrote about Westworld, and she didn't really like it very much. But something about what she wrote stayed with me. Now, I can't name exactly what that was. I just remember her writing about it. That's all I can. It's the only way I can describe it. So a couple of years ago, I was looking for, and I'll be very honest, I was just looking for something to watch on TV on Sunday nights. And I thought, oh, well, Liz, I remember Liz writing about that series. I don't know, it sounded kind of interesting. I'm going to check it out. And I started watching it. And I sort of, you know, felt how she felt about it. I didn't really like it, but I was intrigued by it. So I kept watching it. And there's a, for those of you who aren't familiar with the show, there's a few things I should point out about it. So one, it's entirely set in this fictional Old West theme park. And so somewhere in the future, we're not quite sure how far in the future, but technology has gotten to the point where there are now androids that are indistinguishable from human beings. And so the feeling that you have in the show is that you're basically immersed in a theatrical environment. And that was how I first began to think about it. But as you will see, what I discovered was that it's actually more specific than that. It's not just a theater, it's actually a puppet show. And that this idea that this is actually a puppet world, I think is very important to the meaning of the show and what makes it interesting. The second thing I want to say about it is that it's actually a reboot of a pre-existing cultural artifact, which was the original Westworld, which was premiered in 1973, 3 years after Maury coined the term Uncanny Valley, so right around the same time. It was Michael Crichton from Jurassic Park fame. It was his first sort of big thing. And it starred Yul Brynner as the sort of rampaging robot who, like, suddenly, for some reason that's very mysterious, suddenly starts killing people. And one thing I want to point out that's really struck me in watching the movie is that towards the beginning of the movie, James Brolin, who plays this sort of, well, he's actually the hero because Richard Benjamin's actually the hero. He turns to his friend Richard Benjamin and he says, supposedly you really can't tell except by looking at the hand. They haven't perfected the hands yet. And that's a reference to how you can tell which are the androids and which are the humans. They haven't perfected the hands. Now, this is interesting because Maury's original, what originally triggered Maury's conceptualization of the Uncanny Valley was this very intense experience he had with a prosthetic hand in Vienna. Interesting, something about the hands. Third, the other kind of crucial difference between these two cultural artifacts is that in the original movie, the movie's very much told from the point of view of the humans. Like it's very much, you know, the other is coming to get us, right? But in the series, HBO series, it's very much flipped. It's very much told from the point of view of the androids. It's the humans who seem to be acting out in this incomprehensibly violent way, so that when the androids revolt, it actually seems like a rational thing. It's a response to their sole existence as these machines, lacking agency and which are subject to exploitation, violence, abuse, and destruction at the whims of these supposedly superior human beings. And whereas the metaphor for what goes wrong in the Crichton movie is a virus, In the HBO version, it's more like new neuronal pathways are being forged. And this is why the androids are actually sort of achieving a higher state of consciousness and awareness. And finally, the last thing to point out is that in the original movie, it's very much a white male centered thing, right? Like a lot of cultural artifacts of the time, it's about these two white guys and their experiences in this amusement park. But in the TV show, it's very much told, the two main characters are actually both women, female characters, and one of them is a woman of African descent. And it's very hard to watch that show and see this English, well, she's Thandie Newton, so she's British, but of African descent, basically playing an object. And it's really hard not to think about the history of African bodies in Anglo-American culture being treated as objects. So I'm watching the show and I'm interested in it, but I don't really like it. And I'm sort of interested in it as from the aspect of performance and theater and sort of frames, and it's about performance, and androids get up every day and they do the same performance. And I find that just from a theoretical standpoint kind of interesting, but I'm not really into it. I don't really like the show. And then I had this aha moment one episode where Ed Harris plays a character that is now I realize is a very direct reference to the original movie. It's a direct reference to the Yul Brynner character, who doesn't have a name. Also, the other thing to say about that is Yul Brynner, as you probably know, is sort of very racially ambiguous. And so again, having Thandie Newton play the hero sort of completely flips the hero-villain dynamic completely on its head. So there's a moment where Ed Harris plays the unnamed man in black. So total, like he's the mirror image of the Yul Brynner figure, but he's a human. And I suddenly think of the moment in Don Quixote when Don Quixote inserts himself into the puppet show and starts, like, goes berserk and like literally walks into the puppet show and starts beating up the puppets. And I'm like, oh my God, he's like Don Quixote with the puppets. And suddenly that's when my whole perspective on the show flipped. And that's when I realized what I was actually watching was a puppet show, except the puppets were being played by actors. And then that became really interesting to me. And then I started seeing all these things in it that seemed to be pointing my attention to that idea. But I still didn't like the show, I'll be honest with you. Like, it wasn't touching my heart. I wasn't involved in the story. I was just sort of watching it from this very clinical, analytical perspective. But I kept watching. And then, because then I was going to write about it. I was interested in how did this happen? Like, and what I noticed was that there was a lot of establishing shots that made it very clear, drum roll, that this is taking place in a valley. And it's like, oh, we're in the uncanny valley. They've literally said it in the uncanny valley. Okay, this is interesting. I'm going to now look to see where all this stuff is happening. Somebody clearly has read their Maury. Somebody clearly knows their puppet theory. Because what made the show interesting was looking at it through that lens. So second season, Thandie Newton's character kind of goes on this quest to find her lost child. And that's when I suddenly hooked into it on a heart level. And I got so invested in this character and her journey. And I realized that through my work on looking at the Uncanny Valley and sort of tracing how the Uncanny Valley came into pop culture, that the Thandie Newton character is actually an example of Maury's Buddha and the Robot. And that's where I'm going to leave it. And you'll have to read the book to find out why I say that. The little cliffhanger.
What? Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. I think now we want to have everybody.
We want to talk as a group, man. I mean, I could go on, but we want to talk as a group.
Let's bring everybody back. I understand what you mentioned earlier, Tim and Claudia, about the richness of this area, because so much what you've each talked about is so interesting and so varied, and to make the connections is challenging. So now we're inviting folks who are watching, if they want to ask more questions. And in thinking about the variety of ways that you're looking at these questions of puppets and spirituality, I find myself wanting to ask, for each of you, like, what is spirituality, especially in the 21st century? Like, what do you mean by spirituality? Who should I ask first? Claudia?
I guess spirituality is kind of a big term to encompass a lot of different things, as you're obviously pointing out to. I guess what I'm interested in is the way objects become kind of mediators between the human and some other realm, the things that we can't. So I guess what's interesting to me is that we're always talking about puppets in terms of being so material, and the material of it and materiality, and yet it's through the materiality as a way to something else that we can't really grasp or talk about or see, but we want to affect or have affect us, or so I guess that's the realm in which I'm personally interested in. But I'm interested when I look at the variety of topics that we received, that people are writing on. I'm interested in all the ways the puppet figures or object figures are allow us to have an emotional connection, sometimes with something larger, or to use them as a way to question these kinds of relationships or things that are beyond the mundane.
Would someone else like to jump in? Feel free.
I mean, I think for me, I think of spirituality in two ways. One is sort of trusting this crazy journey we're all on, like, and why we're here, and who knows, are we just embodiments ourselves of other things? Like, are we puppets ourselves? Are we like being, and that, I started off by watching a TV show, and now I've ended up with this book, and like, how the hell did that happen, right? Like, that was such a crazy journey. But also in the show, like, one of Maeve's, like, the character's name is Maeve, like, part of it's about her sort of growing awareness of her own identity, her own consciousness, her own, like, sort of, I feel like spirituality is this constant process of growing in knowledge of just the connections between things.
Deepsikha or Anna?
Yeah, I can go. I think if my internet is not that great, I'll turn off my camera. But in terms of spirituality in India, but also having grown up in India and having grown up in a fairly spiritual world, I would say that, there's this, I was reading this book by Peter van der Veer, who looks at spirituality in India and China and talks about, this transcendence and eminence. And in a way, everything we do in these kinds of mass traditions, puppet traditions, is making it imminent, right? Like, going from the village to the temple and making it accessible, right? And sort of like making it a polysensory experience, right? You're hearing, listening, chanting, singing, seeing, like all of these together, right? So that creation of that, like, is sort of the spiritual world within this context. But I also want to like fight against this othering tendency we have, and even I can even like blame myself for this. It's not like the people who are in this world who are performing are disconnected from the Western world. They're simultaneously in both, right? So they can they know that this particular thing is ritual while this particular thing is not ritual. So there's this like constant traversing of the worlds.
Anna, did you have a thought about my question?
Sure.
What does spirituality mean to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, personally, it's like I really connected with what Tim was saying. I come from a deeply Catholic country, Mexico. So it's kind of almost a given, right? Like, objects have powers, and especially when to connect with those who are missing. right? I mean, we do that, like at home we do that, right? You keep the effects, you keep the things of your grandma who's not here, I mean, that has huge, and you venerate those objects. So for me, it's more, you know, like, I mean, this volume provides this, and thinking about spirituality of that, like how objects stand in or become vessels to have a moment. I don't know if to mention it, communion, or just to have a moment with those who are not with us.
Right.
Yeah, Anna, I was reading your chapter. I was so struck by that in the list of things, when you would list you have these groups of list of objects, right? In every one of those lists, at least one of those objects was a rosary or a scapula,
Yes.
or a Bible or a prayer book. And
yes.
Certainly growing up, I remember, the women in my family, they always had their rosary on them. They
Yes.
always had their prayer book. Claudia had mentioned Hazel Rickard. In Hazel's chapter, she talks about the spiritual community that distributed little bottles of water, and that those little bottles of water, and that kind of connects to. I suddenly made that connection with the piece that you're talking about.
Exactly, and and we did. Yeah, and we still do that. I mean, my mom comes to my house and it's like, oh, let me put things, and I mean, it's kind of, and yeah, I mean, and objects, and yeah, the migrants would carry, there's a special saint for migrants, a special amulets, a special things, a special prayers, a special, so I think it's that connection of the spirituality that I'm trying to look at.
There's a couple of good questions here. I thought maybe to ask one by Frank Proshen. I think I'm always pronouncing Frank's last name wrong. And then maybe Jenabeth Davidson. But Frank asks, in the volume, do you look at iconoclasm and how religious orthodoxy can actively suppress puppetry because it offends God's monopoly over creation? For example, Muslim fundamentalists versus African puppetry.
I think we have at least one paper. The interesting thing is we haven't seen all the papers yet because we have a lot of proposals, and in June 1st we're going to be getting all of our first drafts of everything. So it's kind of ongoing conversation. But I think we have a paper on Indonesian Muslim puppetry, right? That's going. Oh no, puppetry in Iran.
Puppetry in Iran.
In Iran, that's going to deal with Islam and suppression of puppetry and responses.
Yeah.
So we do, but that's interesting.
Kathy Foley's writing about Islamic shadow puppetry.
Yeah, we have the other one from Iran. So I think we have a couple that do address that, and I'm interested to see how they do it. Although I think what you bring up is interesting. I don't know that that's that as a central topic. I mean, I think we were looking at because we wanted to have so many different religious perspectives represented, was the direction we're going with. But I think your point is interesting.
Claudia, can I jump in? I know this is not related to the book, but I am currently researching Shia Tazia performances, and the kind of relationship to the materiality in the Tazia performances are so uncannily similar to some of the other South Asian and Southeast Asian examples we talk about. So even though there is this distancing from God's monopoly, there is still relevance for that materiality.
Great, thank you. Jenabeth Davidson asks, is anyone delving into the paranormal area and beliefs in objects being possessed by spirits? Does that get into what Hazel Rickard is talking about at all?
She takes it in a very different direction. And I think, we didn't really we went with what people were also giving us and things that people were interested in. There are a couple of discussions of contemporary performers that I think there's an interesting Japanese contemporary performance that's being analyzed that I think might go a little bit in this direction. We didn't get any Chucky, sort of that kind of possessed object. I mean, certainly a lot of possession in objects, but maybe not so much in that I mean, I mean, I think it's an element, but I guess not in terms of the term paranormal per se.
Right. It seems to me that I'm sorry. It seems to me that maybe that like the way Geneviève's facing that question, like I think of paranormal area, I think of like you know, Hollywood movies, and what we're talking about is puppets that embody spirits, but not in a negative way. Like I think of paranormal and possessed by spirits as sort of a horror movie, but we're talking about a more benign or positive aspect. Frank has another question. Does anyone look at the economic disincentives of spirituality vis-a-vis puppetry? For instance, there are numerous Southeast Asian examples where the ritual obligations to feed the spirits are so arduous that they become obstacles to the practice and the transmission of the tradition. This is an area of Frank's special work, so he knows a lot about this. It simply costs too much financially or otherwise to do the rituals to appease the spirits, and thus simpler to let the tradition die. Huh, that's interesting. I've never heard of that, but do any of you have thoughts about this?
Interesting. I was just reading this wonderful book called Shaman's Wages, which is all about the economy in Korea, in this island off the south of Korea, of paying shamans and the frustration with people who don't want to pay and the economy. I mean, I think we don't, but you know, that's such an interesting question because I've been thinking a lot about this recently, having read that book and also thinking about the arts and this sort of kind of excess work that is not tangible, that people don't really want to pay for, like the economics of it, you know, it becomes problematic because it's something that you can't quite see, or you know that's, you know, you're supposed to have in this, the shaman's book, it's all about you know, the people willing to pay for the things that are the offerings, but then it feels like the cost for the shamanic ritual is too much, you know, beyond that, you know. So it's not quite what you're saying, but I think that's an interesting question. I don't know that we have anybody dealing with that, but that's a really interesting approach. We'll have to be thinking about that.
Carol Sterling had a question about, for you, Claudia, specifically about how are these, what ways are underway to preserve these puppets and masks?
Yeah, you know, and I think that relates to the, you know, the thing is, Frank, what you say about the economic questions is interesting because the economic questions, you know, that I hear about in traditions I've been looking at don't tend to have to do with the ritual requirements. I mean, for Nangyai, you know, having a big troupe, getting puppets, you know, carved, preserving puppets. I mean, that is enormously, all of that is enormously expensive. The Wat Kanon, you know, they had got a great big grant from UNESCO to make that museum. And they've made these connections with the local, you know, schools to have performers, and they've been doing performances on the weekends that tourists can come see, you know, and those are all towards preserving things. Wat Bandon, which had that young company that perform, they don't perform so much at the temple on a regular basis for tourists, but they do a lot of performances with other with the puppetry community in Thailand to promote puppetry, to get young people involved, to make people feel like it's really a young person's art. The third one that was made this connection with the university in Bangkok, to try and stage performance. Staging the performance itself is already hugely expensive. So all three of these prominent, the ones that are still doing performances, not just holding puppets, but doing performances, are connected with scholars who are kind of trying to help the companies find ways to promote themselves, to preserve things, to become economically, you know, feasible, to just pass on the tradition. But it's, you know, a little bit touch and go. And these articles that I was reading about from the, at the Lincoln Center Library were already in the 70s, interviews with very old performers at a time when things had completely kind of died out almost. There was like one, you know, guy in his 80s, maybe still doing it, you know, so it's been kind of had these fits and starts of revival, that particular tradition. But I think this is an issue for a lot of them.
Deeps, one thing that's come up in a lot of these books over all these three books is this idea that a lot of artists in these localities are able to monetize some of their craft because of the tourist trade. Is the region that you're talking about, does it get tourists? Is that outside of that economic system, or do they sell these objects ever?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, it's highly monetized, and the artists are, I kind of had to like go into my bargain hunting kind of setup to buy a mask, see a performance. Like in Uttar Kamalbari Hatra, they'll say, okay, if you come at this time, we do this performance for tourists. This is how many thousand rupees we charge. So it's highly monetized. But it's not monetized so much for the locals, though. This island gets a lot of foreigners, and it's monetized for the foreigners. The local people are still coming in as like everyday devotees, so they don't sort of have that relationship. I am kind of a strange person because I'm married into that region. So I had been to that area before it was so monetized. So I saw how that difference happened. So it was interesting to see that.
I think we want to probably draw to a close pretty shortly.
Michelle has an interesting response. Also contributing something to the book and had an interesting response to Frank's question. So we're looking forward to seeing those connections.
Right, Michelle, who's been a guest on our puppet forums and researches in medieval object and puppet performance, says what she's working on will definitely involve thinking about medieval Catholic puppetry and the kind of backlash that she sees as coming with the Reformation and its iconoclasms.
Now, there's a question for you. What's your answer on spirituality, man? How do you?
I'm figuring it out. I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out.
You're searching like the rest of us.
I'm searching. It's there. It's omnipresent. It's omnipresent, and I find, like, I'm a person who apologizes to puppets when I knock into them. So there's something going on there.
Yeah.
I thought of Nancy Staub has a question. How do the words soul and supernatural fit in with the discussion of spirituality? And I guess spirituality with puppets, soul and supernatural.
Well, I'd actually take that question, because part of what I'm looking at with Maury, and part of the reason why am I talking about a TV show and a book about puppetry? Well, Maury would respond, because it's all the same thing. There's really no distinction between the puppet and the human. So I actually would push back on the idea of soul, because I think that's a very Western Descartesian idea. There's a soul and there's a body, but Maury would say it's all spirit. It's all just vibrational energy that the puppet's vibrational energy, we're vibrational energy. It's all spirit.
Other thoughts about this question, soul and supernatural? Nancy also mentions there's a tradition in sub-Saharan Africa of manipulating the corpse. I have read about short performance. I have seen video of dances with a casket. I mean, it's not manipulating the corpse, maybe. It makes me think of the Irish custom. Isn't that, I've read, maybe that's apocryphal, of dancing with the corpse in, one last time. I don't know.
I guess one of the challenges of the book is that, each of these articles is dealing with its own time and place and religion, and that has its own vocabulary and its own, belief system that's being, so we're kind of making links between these things, but of course they're all very localized and specific.
One thing I gained from my experience working with Bread and Puppet, these cycles of death and resurrection that are part of the dramaturgy of many shows in that company, and then I realized, well, that's sort of that's also common with mummers plays and the Christian epic of the Easter story. And puppets are interesting because they, you know, when you're activating a puppet, you're making something dead arise, which is of course related to its uncanny nature, but also the materiality of the objects is often, especially with traditional puppets, leather. Thinking of Claudia's mention of the cow, how the cow died, and whether that's makes it good to be a puppet for Nang Yai. But wood and leather, you know, were once living materials. And we were working with a preservationist who also worked with the Museum of the American Indian in Manhattan, and in preserving some materials, that there was a question of whether they should freeze them to get rid of little insects or something, or to put them in a deoxidizing chamber and take out all the oxygen. And the consultants from the tribes, I guess, from whom the objects had been, with whom the objects had originated, said, well, freezing would be okay, but not deoxidizing, because these are living objects and that would kill them. And the fact that this woman was is a very high-tech professional museum preservationist, that, you know, we're negotiating with these aspects of spirituality in a way all the time is to me super interesting. So go ahead.
One of the interesting things I found is that, you know, these leather puppets are considered very, you know, have these relationships I was talking about in Thailand, but the wooden puppets aren't really in the same world of that. And in Japan, it's all wooden puppets. They don't even have a leather shadow tradition, and the wood is considered sacred. And in Thailand, there's a whole tradition of also considering trees sacred, but then you would never cut them to make a you know, to make a puppet. So that sense of, you know, very disparate kind of cultural sensibility of how you would think about material is also.
And Maury talks about in his book the idea that the steel, the metal components that make up the robot would have come out of Africa or China, would have come out of the earth. That everything, so go back to the idea that spiritual, my sense of spirituality, that everything's connected. The robot contains Mother Earth in its fabrication, you know.
Great. Well, this has been a lot to think about. I appreciate Frank saying another spectacular symposium, because the what you all brought to it was so great. I don't know if Deepsikha wants to turn on her video a last time so we can see you, but thank you very much. I want to thank Tim and Claudia and Anna and Deepsikha, and also behind the scenes Emily Wicks, for this really interesting puppet forum. I hope that maybe when the book is published, we can do this again. And I wanted to let our those interested in the Ballard Institute and Museum of Puppetry know tomorrow night at 8 o'clock is the Yukon Spring Puppet Slam. Please come see that at 8 o'clock here on the same Facebook page. And on Saturday, please come and see Alex and Olmsted perform Milo the Magnificent. We have a donation page if you'd like to support the work of the Ballard Institute. We appreciate it. And thanks for watching. And thanks to you all again, Deepsikha and Anna and Tim and Claudia, for this fascinating look at some of the powerful things that puppets do. So thank you very much. Thank you everybody for watching. See you later. Bye.